There's a reason that European civilization created this enormous gap between them and everybody else. I think it's because Europeans are smarter.
That could be said about Ashkenazis.
I think they are smart.
They are smarter, the smartest.
Well, I would say this. I would say they are probably as smart as the smartest white race. 2% of the population, overrepresented 2,000%. Are they 2,000% smarter? Answer is no. Because if you look at the standardized testing, the top scores in the high school standardized tests are almost all Asians in math and science. As far as Africa is concerned, they didn't have the wheel. But I do think that explains their relative level of development that has been persistent.
How do you pick and choose what you believe and what you don't believe and then form a basis? Like, well, I definitely believe that black people are dumb, but I totally don't necessarily believe, I'm obviously being a little bit hyperbolic here, but I totally don't necessarily believe that Ashkenazis are the smartest. Like, how do you...
Now, there are some studies that say that Ashkenazi Jews do have the highest average IQ, and that does exist.
In any scientific debate, how a body of work enters and persists in the literature is as important as what that work claims. When it comes to global IQ scores and their purported implications for national and racial hierarchies in intelligence, one figure looms very large. That figure is Richard Lynn.
I have probably read more nonfiction books by Richard Lynn than any other nonfiction author I can think of. And some of my favorites are Race Differences in Intelligence, Eugenics, A Reassessment, Dysgenics, IQ and the Wealth of Nations, and The Global Bell Curve. His latest book it's called The Chosen People, a study of Jewish intelligence and achievements. As you can see just in the titles of his book, Richard Lynn has no fear of controversy. But in the meantime, I present to you Professor Lynn, who will speak about the prospects, eugenics and dysgenics, a promise denied. Please welcome Professor Lynn.
I'm sure all of you here are quite familiar with the meaning of the words dysgenics and eugenics, although I have found that among other well-informed people, although the word eugenics is quite well understood, many people are unfamiliar with the word dysgenic. And the reason it is so little known is that it is a profoundly politically incorrect concept, of which the axiom is that some people are better than others.
Richard Lynn is the wonderful person that you just saw speaking. By the early 2000s, alongside co-author Tatu Van Harnen, he published IQ and the Wealth of Nations, a book that attempted to link national economic outcomes to average IQ measurements aggregated across countries. The resulting dataset, frequently referenced online as a map of global IQ, has become, I would say, the default reference in popular discourse and algorithmic search outputs and AI reporting, despite being a racially driven academic farce. From the start, Lynn's work drew serious criticism. Critics highlighted that methodology underpinning these national IQ estimates were deeply problematic and unscientific. Rather than conducting replicable, controlled and representative studies, Lynn and Van Harnen collated disparate tests from random sources, many of which were small, localized and incomparable, and then averaged or extrapolated them, often with no transparent criteria for inclusion or adjustment, basically fudging the numbers to meet their own prejudices. For example, estimates for countries with no data were sometimes derived by imputing values from neighbouring nations rather than measured samples. So we don't know this nation, but we have this nation and this nation, so we'll just put it in the middle. That's really scientific. As you can see, there's nothing academic about that. It's just flagrantly unacademic. More troubling than the methodological sloppiness, if that's even possible, was Lynn's explicit framing of these results within a genetic and racial hierarchy. He authored works such as Race Differences in Intelligence, which argued that cognitive differences between racial groups had a genetic basis because, yeah, of course he did. It's important to note that this is a claim that contemporary research does not support, and that mainstream scientists have condemned as ideologically driven without empirical grounding. Lynn's financial dependency on ideologically charged networks, including his long involvement with the Pioneer Fund, an organisation established by advocates of eugenics and race betterment in the early 20th century, helps to contextualise the agenda of his scholarship. His national IQ dataset, critics argue, was not generated by impartial inquiry, but rather by biased selection criteria that disproportionately included low-scoring samples for regions like, sub-Saharan Africa, while neglecting contradictory evidence, of which he had plenty. It's almost as though he was working to create a scientific basis for the ideological beliefs held by his funders. Funny that.
I am shocked. Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
Researchers such as Yelt Wickertz and colleagues found that selective inclusion rather than systematic criteria drove key decisions about which samples to include in Lynn's African estimates. These appear to be correlated with the magnitude of the IQ reported. Any surprises there? Now, the most disappointing thing is, despite these documented flaws, Lynn's work still achieved widespread circulation, not just among fringe ideologues and idiots like Musk, but also through mainstream academic publishers and, more recently, AI-powered search engines automatically surfacing numbers as authoritative answers to queries like Pakistani IQ and Sierra Leone IQ. These automated systems have presented precise figures, for example 45.07 for Sierra Leone, which is obviously incorrect, drawn from Lynn's datasets, lending an unwarranted veneer of scientific legitimacy to work that experts regarded as debunked and racist pseudoscience. The disconnect between the notoriety of Lynn's results and the lack of decisive academic repudiation highlights a systemic failure in scientific self-correction. Major journals have been slow to retract or adequately contextualize Lynn's articles, even as his national IQ data continues to be cited widely. Calls from coalitions of researchers to retract many of Lynn's publications on the grounds that they propagate racist ideas under the guise of scientific inquiry have so far yielded limited action from journals such as Elsevier and Springer. Once again, academia gently plays into the hands of scientific racism by their decided inaction, something that I'm all too familiar with seeing in my field. Even scientific bodies like European Human Behaviour and Evolution Association have issued formal statements advising against the use of Lynn's national IQ dataset, noting that its methodological foundations are insufficient to support reliable inference and that its use risks propagating racist conclusions, even when employed by well-intentioned researchers. I state all of this to underscore how one flawed, ideologically motivated intellectual lineage, one that conflates poor data, biased sampling and racial presuppositions, became amplified into a quasi-canonical source for global IQ rankings. In this case, repetition was key, and with enough pseudo-scientific articles and forums circulating these fabricated numbers, they became socially canonized. The persistence of Lynn's work in both academic citations and digital search results illustrates how scientific errors can be naturalized into cultural facts when systems fail to challenge them robustly. Following this, we will examine the methodological weaknesses in greater detail, interrogate the logic of extrapolating national intelligence, and situate IQ measurements within socioeconomic, cultural, and developmental contexts, all of which demonstrate that IQ scores tell us far more about sampling bias than they do about innate human capacities. I hope you find this interesting. Stay tuned.
know what you